האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobro V'Yetcher. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Balak, and we're going to take a look at 3 psukim from the Parsha before we begin the Zera Shimshon. These 3 psukim deal with the sin of the Jewish people that they committed by getting involved with the women of Moab, the Benos Moab, the daughters of Moab. So this is Perek Chafhei in Parshas Balak, Psukim Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. Vayeshev Yisrael Bashitim, and Yisrael dwelled in a place called Shittim. Vayochel Ha'am, and the people began liznos, to turn astray, El Benos Moab, to the daughters of Moab. Pasuk Beis, Vatikrena La'am Lizivche Eloheihen, and they, the women of Moab, called the people of Yisrael to come to the feasts that they were having, to the sacrificial feasts they were having for their God. Vayochal ha'am, and the people ate, vayishtachavu leloheihen, and they bowed down to their gods. Pasuk Gimel, vayitzomed Yisrael leval peor, and the Jewish people became connected. Yisrael became connected, or bound up with the god that they worshiped, called Baal Peor. Vayichar af Hashem b'Yisrael, and the anger of Hashem flared against Yisrael. And that is the beginning of a very tragic and shocking episode. And now let us get right into the Zera Shimshon, Os Yud, section 10. Vatikrena la'am lezivche Eloheihen. And this is one of the psukim we just read. And they called to the people to the sacrifices of their gods, Vayochal ha'am, and the people ate, Yishtachavu, and they bowed down, V'chule, etc. Vayitzomed Yisrael, and the Jewish people became connected to Baal Peor, V'chule, etc. And that's the quote from a little bit from the two of the 3 psukim we looked at. Makshim, the commentators ask, Lama herich hakosov kol kach. Why did these psukim stretch things out so much? Why did they seemingly give us so much extraneous information? Hoyelo lomar bekitzur. The pasuk, the Torah, could have said things in a much more succinct form. Vatikrena la'am, the Moabite women called to the people, to the Jewish men, vayishtachavu leloheihen, and the men bowed down to their idols. That's all it had to say, and that would encapsulate what we needed to know, that the Moabite women seduced the men, or convinced the men to come bow down to their idols. The old kosher. So that's question number 1, which is why does the 3 psukim give us seemingly a lot of extra information in this story that we don't really need, or we don't seem to need? The old kosher. Another question: Ma shaychus udevekus. What's the relevance and the connection yesh la'achila im ha'hishtachavo, to the eating and the bowing down? Meaning, if you look at the psukim, it says the people came and they ate and they bowed down. So the Zera Shimshon says that's worthy of a question all by itself. What kind of connection is the Torah trying to tell us about when it says they ate and they bowed down? It would seem that they're 2 totally different things. If it was sinful for them to come and eat the food that they ate, okay. But that doesn't, just because you eat a person, just because they ate food they weren't supposed to eat, doesn't mean that they're automatically going to bow down to the idols of the that were presented to them by the Moabite women. So why is the Torah making those things seem connected when we don't know of a connection between the Jewish men coming and eating of the food that was offered to them and then bowing down to the idols? And a third question: She'im karu osam lezivche Eloheihen. If the Torah told us that the Moabite women called them to the sacrificial feasts for their gods, vayishtachavu, and they bowed down Pshita she'ochlu nami, it's obvious that they also ate. So now the Zera Shimshon's kind of taking one of the earlier questions and turning it a little bit around and saying, first he asked, why did it have to tell us at all that they ate? And now he's saying, if you tell us they were invited to feasts and then they ended up bowing down, we could assume that they came to the feasts and that they ate. So why is it told to us clearly, that they ate at these, that they partook of the food at these sacrificial feasts? So those are the Zera Shimshon's three questions. Basically, fundamentally, there's a common denominator in the questions, which is, what is the significance of the eating? Why is it mentioned? How is it connected to the bowing down? And once you're telling me that they were invited to the meals, to meals, and they bowed down, then at that point you could go back and say it doesn't need to be mentioned. But it seems to be not only mentioned but emphasized. So why is that? What's going on here in the story that we're supposed to realize there's a central role to the eating that was going on, to the food and the eating? Next paragraph. Yesh lomar, and we can say, the beperek ches de Yoma, in the 8th chapter of Meseches Yoma, pligi, there's an argument brought down in the Gemara. Chad Omar, one master says, one of the rabbis one of the rabbis says, Shahamon Tamid Hoyanivla Biramach Evorim. The mun was always absorbed into the 248 limbs of each Jewish person's body, meaning that when they ate mun, according to this school of thought, when they ate mun in the midbar, in the wilderness, the mun was completely absorbed into their bodies. It gave them all the nutrition they needed, and they did not need to excrete wastes. Ukra, and then the pasuk v'yaseh tiyeh lecha. There's a pasuk, as you can see in Sefer Devarim, which says that when people in the midbar needed to relieve themselves, to excrete waste, they needed to carry a little spade, a little shovel with them, and they needed to go out to a place that was set aside for like latrines, bathrooms. They would take their little shovel and they would dig a hole, they would relieve themselves, and then they would cover it up. That's the Torah addresses that and states that it's important not to have people defecating and relieving themselves all around the camp. The camp was a holy, sacred place, and that would defile the camp. So you had to go walk away from where the people lived and go outside to designated areas, or to just far out into the desert, dig a hole and cover up your excrement, cover up your wastes. So if the mun that they ate when they were in the wilderness in the midbar was absorbed into their bones and didn't produce any waste material, and they didn't need to relieve themselves after eating the mun, why does the pasuk tell them about the shovel and how to excrete and cover up their waste? That should never have happened. So the Gemara over there answers, mitokam, that can be established, b'devorim shetagore umosa olam evian lahem. That referred to what they needed to do if and when they ate food that merchants of the other nations brought to them. So let's pause here before we get into the second opinion and the second school of thought about the mun and how it was absorbed into the body. The first opinion says clearly the mun that the Jewish people ate was completely absorbed. It did not need to come out of their body as wastes. So therefore, the Gemara says, okay, why does the Torah talk about what to do when you need to relieve yourself? And the Gemara answers, they did need occasionally to relieve themselves because they had access to food from various merchants who would come by, like Bedouin travelers. People would come by the camp and sell different food items. And the Jews, of course, it had to be kosher, so the Jews would buy food from these merchants that they could eat, perhaps vegetables and fruits and things like that. and Bnei Yisrael would buy things, could have the choice to buy things. And if they ate those things, those foods did, according to this first school of thought, produce wastes. And therefore they would at times need to relieve themselves. And that's why the Pasuk had to tell them in Devarim about a shovel and what to do. What was the proper procedure of digging a hole and covering up the wastes? Good, that's one opinion. Continuing, Vechad Omar, and another of the great rabbis says, Afilu Devarim, even those things, Sha'umos Mochrim Lahem, that the non-Jewish salesman sold to them, Mon Mifigam, the Mon caused them to be absorbed. So according to the second opinion, the Mon had an even more incredible power. Not only did the mun give them all the nourishment they needed and didn't produce any waste products at all and was absorbed into their bodies to nourish them while producing any leftovers, any wastes, any excrement. Not only did it do that, but it caused the food that the Jewish people could buy from these passing merchants, it caused it to be absorbed. So that means that whatever they ate, whether they ate the mun or whether they ate food that was brought to them from other nations, whatever they ate, it was absorbed through the power of the mun into their bodies, and they didn't produce wastes. So now the Gemara, of course, asks again, Umani mekayim v'yosei tiyelecha. So now the question's even stronger. According to this second school of thought, why did the Torah and Devarim have to tell us that Hashem told the people, take a shovel with you and go outside of the camp when you need to relieve yourself, and what to do? They should never have needed to relieve themselves because everything was fully absorbed into their body, according to this second opinion. So the Gemara answers, Le'achar shesorchu. After they did something bad, after they corrupted the situation, okay? What that means is that at a certain point, Bnei Yisrael did not treat the mun with its proper respect and appreciation, and that was called sarchu. They went bad on the mun, they corrupted themselves, and they messed up the wonderful situation that they had with the mun. And after that happened, then they did need to relieve themselves. They no longer were protected by the mun, and they did have to relieve themselves. And that's when the pasuk about the little shovel going out and digging holes and covering up excrement would apply. Okay, let's go to the next paragraph. Upirshu sham, and it is explained over there in the commentators, demachaluk tamhu, that the argument between the different opinions is based on ima shehislonenu b'shana shniya, when they complained about the mun in the second year. Okay, they left Mitzrayim and they're in the Midbar, and during the second year they complained about the mun. She'amru, and they said, ve'ata nafshenu yevesha ein kol, and now our souls are dried up. There is nothing that they wanted to eat or desired to eat. And they said the mun was not something that they desired to eat. It left them dry. So the one opinion says about that pasuk, v'chulei, etc., mikre sirchon gomor. That was considered complete corruption. That was a statement already in the second year in the Midbar. They made that statement about the mun, and that was a very, very big mistake, a complete mistake. And from that moment on, we can say that the mun no longer worked the way it was supposed to work, because they had spoken derisively about it, and therefore it no longer functioned the way it could, the way it did in the beginning. Olo, or perhaps not. One opinion says, no, that is not true. That was not a sirchon gomor. That was not a completely terrible remark that they made about the mun, and the mun did not lose its power at that point. Aval, however, mashe sarchu, when they definitely made a mistake and ruined the protection of the mun, bishnas ha'arboyim, took place in the 40th year. La'achar shemes Aharon. So now this is towards the end of their whole 40-year travel through the Midbar. after Aharon died, she'omru, when the people said, v'nafshenu kotza, our souls are disgusted, balechem hakilokel, top of the next column, with this bread that is unworthy, with this wretched bread. When they said that, when they came right out and said terrible things about the mun, then everyone agrees that that was a sirchon gadol, a complete collapse of any kind of appreciation of the mun. And then the mun for sure stopped providing its protection and needed to be excreted and no longer would be fully absorbed in their bodies. So Zera Shimshon says, Kule alma modu. And so we see from that discussion, that argument between the schools of thought about when they said things that ruined the power of the mun, Kule alma modu, everyone agrees, but all opinions agree, de have sirchon gomor, that in the end, in the 40th year, they had said things that ruined the protection of the manu, misham v'hola, and from then and onward, posak hamun, the mun ceased, milios nivla be'evarim, to be absorbed in their limbs. V'ayin sham, you can look over there in that Gemara and in the commentators. So what does this mean for us? Let's pause for a moment. What this means for us is that the Zera Shimshon, as he often does, is setting the table by bringing in sources and by developing them. So he has now brought us a source from the Gemara in Yoma that talks about two different opinions about the mun, whether it was absorbed but other food wasn't absorbed, or whether the mun caused everything they ate to be absorbed, in which case the Gemara can say that either they never needed to relieve themselves in the midbar when the mun was functioning properly, according to the second opinion, or according to the first opinion, they did need to relieve themselves if and when they ate food that was not the mun from these passing salesmen, these passing merchants sold them other food. That food, of course, according to the first opinion, they did need to excrete. And that Gemara is focused on the fact that obviously at some point in the midbar, they needed to excrete wastes and defecate, because the Torah deals with what to do. What's the proper procedure when you need to relieve yourself that way, and how you take a shovel with you and what you do. So that Gemara standing by itself is one of the sources that the Zera Shimshon wants us to be well aware of. And then he added to that the fact that some of the commentators explain that what's really going on in that Gemara is a machlokas about why the mun stopped protecting them and the people, and when it stopped protecting them. And by protecting, we mean causing protecting them from having to relieve themselves and having to defecate, and the mun being absorbed fully into their bodies. And what's agreed on over there is by the time the Bnei Yisrael got to the 40th year in the midbar, and they then said terrible things about the mun, that was a complete collapse. That for sure, according to all opinions, caused the mun to lose its effectiveness in terms of not requiring elimination. And they did at that point have to relieve themselves. And for sure, that's when the mitzvah of taking the shovels and covering things up certainly would apply. According to one school of thought, it applied even earlier. So to go back to our conversation about the sin with the Benos Moav, that took place after the final collapse of the power of the mun. So they certainly needed to relieve themselves at that point when the daughters of Moab were trying to get them to bow down to their idols. And we'll see how that becomes extremely relevant in the next paragraph and going forward. The Lochein Omar HaKosav, and therefore the pasuk says, Lo dai shevatikreno lo'om lezivchei Eloheihen. It wasn't enough. It wasn't sufficient a sin that the Moabite women called to the Jewish men and they came to their feasts for their idols. Ela af vayochal ha'am vayishtachavu leloheihen. But the people also ate, meaning not only did they eat at the feasts that the Moabite women were setting up for them, for their idols, but they also ate their own food and then bowed down and worshiped the idols of the Moabite women, Baal Peor specifically. Klomar, this means to say, Af masha hayu ochlin min hamon, even what they ate from the mon, their own food, hayu motzi re'i, it brought out excrement, v'hayu moil avodas peor, and this assisted with the disgusting and almost incomprehensible, unimaginable worship of Peor, which we'll unfortunately need to describe in a moment. Va'avaras hasirchon shehislonenu, and the passing of the corruption that they complained, ve'omru nafshenu kotza, and they said, our souls are sick, we're disgusted by the mun, Goram lahem lahosiv zadon al pesha, that caused them to add intentional transgression to the sin they were already committing, ba'avodas peor, in the worship of peor. Let's pause here. For those who aren't familiar with it, and it's probably lucky if you haven't heard this until now, because it saves you from a very repellent idea, which is the following: that the way that people worship, those who were followers of Baal Peor, the idolatry called Baal Peor, the way they worshiped their idols was to defecate in front of the idol. That was considered its proper worship. So what the Zera Shimshon is saying is that by the time the 40th year came around and Jewish men are being led astray by Moabite women, and the Moabite women are saying, come, eat at our feasts, worship in front of our idols, which means defecate in front of our idols, the Jewish men at that point not only partook of the food that the Moabite women put out, which of course would produce excrement, but even the mun that they ate would produce excrement at that point, because by their own critical and disrespectful remarks about the mun, they had lost the protection of the mun. It wasn't fully absorbed into their bodies, and so it, so to speak, added to the amount of excrement that they used to worship the Baal Peor, and this increased their avera. They were considered to be doing more worship of Baal Peor because of the mun that they ate beforehand. So they took the holy sacred mun, disrespected it, and ultimately, so to speak, used it to produce waste to worship Baal Peor in its sickening way. So that's one explanation that the Zera Shimshon developed for us to understand and answer the three questions that he posed in the beginning. Let's just go back to that. We said the common denominator was, why do the psukim that we read from Parshas Balak, why do those psukim seem to focus so much on the invitation to a meal by the Moabite women to the Jewish men, the fact that the Jewish men ate at that meal? Why is the eating and the bowing down and the worshiping seemingly put together inextricably? What's the connection? So now we understand that when you wish to worship Baal Peor, eating beforehand was part of the Avodah Zarah. It was what we might call a hechsher, a preparation for how you would worship the idol. If a person had not eaten and their body would not produce wastes, then they could not worship the idol, the Baal Peor, properly. Only if a person ate and ate a lot could the person then be able to produce the waste material needed to properly worship Baal Peor, and that's why the food in the meal, the idolatrous meal, and the also any food that the Jews ate beforehand, for example, their own mun, which they ate every day, all of that combined to produce wastes for the purpose of worshiping Baal Peor, and everything was corrupted because of that. Everything became tainted because of that. Continuing, inami, or alternatively, there's another explanation. Yesh lomar, we can say, the Isa b'perek Zayin de Sanhedrin. It states in the Gemara in the 7th chapter of Maseches Sanhedrin, the Isha achas sho'alo lakomerim. A woman, a non-Jewish woman in this case, asked the priests, she asked the priests of Baal Peor, Bameh ovdin lePeor. How is it that a person worships the idol of Peor? So this woman wanted to know how to worship Baal Peor, that idol. Amrullah, they said to her, Ochlin tiradin v'shosin shechar chodosh. First you eat beets, and then you drink new beer that was freshly made. Umasrizin lefanov, and then you relieve yourself in front of the Baal Peor. So the priest said to her, along the lines of what we said a moment ago, it's not just enough to show up and try to worship Peor. You're not just going to bow down. That's not how you worship this idol. You're not just going to put a little food in front of it or put a wreath around its neck. That's not what's going on here. You need to go away, eat these special foods, the beets and the freshly made beer, and then when you come back, you'll be ready to worship Baal Peor properly by relieving yourself in front of the idol. Lefi shehem devorim hamishalshalines hameayim, because these foods, the beets and the fresh beer, loosen up the bowels, umarbim zevel, and they increase the amount of excrement that a person needs to get rid of. Nimtzenu lemeidim, we learn from this, shaha'avodas peor ena teluya. Worship of the idol of Baal Peor is not only dependent behazevel v'hara'i, with the excrement and the waste, hanohug latzeis min b'nei adam, that a person would be accustomed to expel ba'achilosam haragila, after regularly eating, right? Everyone, human beings, we eat foods and drink drinks, and then we relieve ourselves. But Baal Peor requires more than that to properly worship it. You needed to eat special foods like these beets and like this wine, and I'm sure other people probably recommended other types of food, in order to produce even more a prodigious outflow of excrement and waste. And so now let's go back and understand how this explanation can fit into the psukim, next paragraph on the bottom left. The Omar HaKosav in the Pasuk says, Vatikreno lo'om lezivchei Eloheihen, and the Moabite women called to the Jewish men to come to their sacrificial feasts. Velodai lohem she'ochlu mehazevochim. And it wasn't enough that the men came to eat from the sacrifices in v'yishtachavu leloheihen and to bow down to their idols. Ela af vayochal ha'am v'yishtachavu. They ate beforehand and then they bowed down. She'ochlu devarim hamishalshalim. They inquired, the Jewish men inquired and said, what should we eat that can help us worship your idol Baal Peor in the best way, in the most appropriate, impressive way? And they told him, here's what you need to eat, these beets and this fresh beer, and again, probably other things as well. And they ate those things. They stopped and they said, well, we want to go eat those things so we can really worship Baal Peor in the best way. In order to serve the idols of Baal Peor in a complete and great way. They wanted to really score bonus points in their worship of Baal Peor. Ubishvil zeh, because of this, vayitzomed Yisrael Baal Peor, the pasuk says the Jewish men came connected and bonded to the idols of Baal Peor. Shelefi shehirbu lachto, because they went out of their way to increase their level of sin. Nidbiku ba, they became stuck to the Baal Peor kitzomid pisil, like a tightly put on lid. Picture a lid that screws on very tightly to, let's say, a jar, and you turn it until it's tightly screwed on. That's the way the Torah describes the connection that developed between these men and the Baal Peor. So we have a situation which is highly shocking and highly disturbing, of Jewish men after 40 years in the Midbar being so corrupted by the Moabite women that they are looking for ways to better and improve their worship, their disgusting and sickening worship of the Moabite nation's idols, Baal Peor. Normally, amongst the Bnei Yisrael, it would be safe to assume at that time, certainly, that everyone would have run away and said, "What? Worship Baal Peor? Defecate in front of their idols? What a disgusting, disgraceful, unthinkable thing to do." But they had fallen, a certain amount of men had fallen into this trap, and they had allowed themselves to be seduced, and they had gone to the sacrificial parties and feasts, participated, ate, even eating more and drinking more in order to do this terrible avera, which led to the tragic punishments and consequences that followed upon the story. Yasher Koch for learning in the Zera Shimshon with us this week on Parshas Balak. God willing, we look forward to learning together in next week's Parsha again in the commentary of the Zera Shimshon.